Glory to Jesus Christ, friends. I want to have a video here. It's going to be a little longer than usual to speak about this theme, enemies of my enemy, medieval Europe's fear of Islam, and the modern conservative fascination with Russia. This has been something that's been on my mind for a few weeks now, and I'd like to kind of sketch this out. And if you have any criticisms or suggestions, please feel free to share them in the comments section below. So allow me to begin this with some history. Throughout history, ideological fear has often driven people to embrace morally questionable allies. We saw this, we don't have to go back 2,000 years, we saw this during the Second World War, when the United States and Britain allied with communist Russia. Such was their fear of a Nazi takeover of Europe. So this has happened throughout history. But if we go back to medieval Europe, there's the existential dread of Islamic expansion. And this fed the flames of a rumored mythical Christian king called Prester John. I encourage you to go online and read about it. It's fascinating history. And so this Prester John, whom Europeans hoped would aid in the struggle against Islam, turned out to be simply a mythical figure. When the Mongols emerged as this, as the violent, destructive force that they were, Christians began to imagine them as this prophesied ally. So the king of the Mongols, this must be the prophesied ally, Prester John. And they overlooked the brutal assaults of the Mongols on Christian kingdoms. My point is that love of this life led many Christians to forsake the lesson of the psalmist. In Psalm 91, verse 12, we read that, I will say to the Lord, you are my refuge and my fortress, my God in whom I trust. Notice that verse doesn't say, men's armies or men's empires. No, only God is the one in whom we place our trust. In modern times, many American conservatives, and I consider myself a conservative, many American conservatives, my own kind of ilk, are gripped by anxiety over liberal cultural shifts, toxic and vile as they are. And they have turned to Vladimir Putin's Russia as a supposed champion of Christian values. Much like their medieval counterparts, they've selectively ignored atrocities and authoritarianism in the pursuit of some kind of ideological alignment against enemies. And so this talk really explores the historical parallel, and I hope to reveal the persistent danger of letting fear shape alliances more than principles or facts. So let's look at the context here. Medieval Europe and the Islamic threat. We're living today amongst a rising Islamic demographic in Western nations. And, people just wave their hand as, it doesn't mean anything. Well, it actually does. There are some real dangers with this demographically. But this video isn't about that. But it poses significant challenges to our faith, our culture, our politics, our values, whether you're secular or religious. But let's look at this historically. From the 7th century onward, the Islamic caliphates rapidly expanded across the formerly Christian lands of the Middle East, North Africa, and into Europe, conquering former Christian countries like Syria, Egypt, and up into the Iberian Peninsula, Spain. Now, the fall of Jerusalem, the holy city, to Muslim forces in the year 637, and later to Saladin in the 12th century, really became a rallying cry for Christian Europe. The Crusades, beginning around 1095, were driven by a sober realization that Islam threatened the spiritual and political unity of Christendom. In fact, that it was an existential threat. And make no mistake about it, there is no apology for the Crusades in principle. They were, in principle, a delayed reaction on the part of Christendom after 400 years of unprovoked Islamic atrocities against Christians and others. And they showed no willingness to relent. When I say they, I mean the Muslims. This went on for hundreds of years. And so finally, the Christians of Europe say, okay, it's been 400 years. We have to act in unison to defend those who cannot defend themselves, and to recover the holy sites. The loss of Christian cities, the growing power of the Abbasid and later the Ottoman empires, and the defeat of and defeats, like the Battle of Hattin, reinforced this fear. In an example I want to give is Pope Urban. In his speech in Clermont, famous in 1095, he called Muslims, a race alien to God, and he framed the Crusades as a divinely ordained counteroffensive. Now let's look at the myth of Prester John. And again, you can go online and you can read lots of and watch some videos on him. It's fascinating. But the legend of Prester John emerged in the 12th century, first appearing in a letter around the year 1165, and it was sent to, apparently, allegedly, to the Byzantine emperor. And Prester John was described as a powerful Christian monarch ruling a vast eastern kingdom filled with riches, miracles, beyond the Islamic world. And this myth gained traction after the defeat of a Muslim leader in India. And that defeat of the Muslim leader in India, it kind of took on a life of its own. And by the time it reached Europe, it was misreported. And this led to this growing legend of Prester John, of this mighty king in the East who was taking down the Islamic Empire from the other side of the map. Well, Europeans hear this, and you have to understand, they've gone through, by this point, 600 years of pretty much consistent defeat at the hands of the Islamic world. And the civilized world had been overtaken by Islam. And so Europeans hear about this, and they project onto this mythical mighty figure who's defeating the mighty Muslims, they project onto him their desire for a supernatural Christian ally who would emerge from the East to crush Islam from behind. And the papacy and various European courts took the myth seriously, and they sent envoys eastward in search of Prester John. You can read about the Dominican friar Ricaldo de Monte. He wrote about this, and others in the 13th century. So let's look at the Mongols. So there are these rumors in the consciousness of Europe already. And at the same time as this is happening, Genghis Khan arises. And the Mongols under Genghis Khan and his successors, they devastated many empires, among them Christian empires. We forget that Armenia and Georgia and Kiev Rus were empires in their path and were devastated in 1236 to 1242 in that era. In Georgia, the city of Tbilisi was sacked and its population was massacred. In Christian Armenia, monasteries, which were often spared by the Mongols, because we have to remember up to perhaps a third of the Mongols may have been Nestorians. But so they typically didn't touch sacred sites. But in Armenia, even the monasteries and the churches were looted and destroyed. And in Kiev Rus, cities like Kiev were razed to the ground. Tens of thousands were killed. An estimate I read was that only about 4% of the population of Kiev survived the Mongol attack, meaning like 96% of the people were butchered. Now, despite these atrocities, European courts increasingly saw the Mongols as potential allies in the fight against Islam, especially after they defeated the mighty Muslim Khwarezmian Empire. Now, the Mongols' religious tolerance led many, as I said earlier, some of them, there were Buddhists, animists, Christians, some Muslims among the Mongols, but vast majority of them were animists. But their kind of religious tolerance, in one sense, led many Europeans to falsely believe that the Mongols were latent Christians or that they were easy targets for conversion. And for this, Louis the Ninth of France, Pope Innocent the Fourth, I believe, they both sent diplomatic missions to the Mongols. Giovanni Carpine and William Rubric. And you can read, actually, Christopher Dawson edited a book called Mission to Asia, in which he speaks about, goes into some detail about these missions by the Franciscan emissaries. And in there, they document Mongol beliefs and customs. It's a fascinating read, Mission to Asia, edited by Christopher Dawson. So anyhow, these envoys often reported Mongol demands for submission, but their findings were really downplayed in favor of the narrative of alliance. The fantasy, the sheer fantasy that the Mongols were descendants of the 10 lost tribes or allies of Prester John persisted in European consciousness despite overwhelming evidence of their violence. And there's a key point here. Christian Europe and the papacy, they had a willingness to pursue this alliance, and it shows how their fear of Islam clouded their moral and strategic judgment, leading Christian leaders to romanticize a deeply violent empire. And this is a lesson in sin, is that it clouds our judgment and it weakens our will, individually and collectively. So let's look at the modern parallels to this. Conservative America and Christian Russia. Today, many on the American political right perceive liberalism not just as a political movement, but as a moral and existential threat to Christianity and to the world. And I don't think they're wrong in that. I believe exactly the same thing. I believe that secular liberalism, devoid of God, devoid of reason, is not just a philosophical threat, but it's an existential threat, for it carves out of man that which is his core. But there's a line here, is that we cannot so hate our enemy as to desire their destruction, for God doesn't do that. We ought to love our enemies. But what we have here is a tendency on the part of conservatives to so hate their enemy as to embrace other enemies, so long as my enemy's enemy is my enemy. And we see that this leads to the embrace of Vladimir Putin's Russia by some conservatives. And where does it come from? Well, it stems from, desperation, I think. I think it's a sin against faith. They don't want to believe that God's in charge and he's going to purify us like he purified Israel during the time of Jeremiah for its infidelities. They don't want that, and they want to force some kind of way out of this. And they see in some of the things Vladimir Putin has done, the 2013 law against gay propaganda, crackdowns against feminism, his promotion of Russian Orthodox Christianity and quote-unquote traditional values. And influential conservatives have openly praised Russia. Tucker Carlson, on America, on Fox News, questioned why Americans should hate Putin. Steve Bannon, whom everyone I think knows, has referred to Russia as a bulwark of Christian civilization against Western secularism. Now, and then there's another example which I want to talk about here. And it's the example of, you have here coming up on August 5th. This is being recorded on August 4th, so tomorrow. This is an example of how this is playing out in real time. You have the New York Young Republican Club. They've invited Robert Amsterdam to speak at an event in New York City on August 5th, and he's going to speak on this topic, Zelensky's war on Christian Ukraine. Now, this is where I want to kind of hit the pause in this video to go into a little bit of depth on the absurdity of this, of fellow conservatives bringing in someone like Robert Amsterdam, who doesn't, as far as I know, speak Ukrainian or Russian, but is making claims that do not correspond to fact. And this undermines conservative claims on faith and family and freedom. It's going to taint our voices. And I'm speaking up because this cannot be tolerated. So, and I speak up with some authority on this because I visited Ukraine 3 times since the war began. I went to these sites that Robert Amsterdam is speaking about, and it doesn't correspond to the facts. He's made several public claims alleging widespread persecution of the Russian-backed Orthodox Church in Ukraine. He is their legal representative. And while some concerns about freedom of religion are legitimate topics of debate, a number of his claims have been shown to be misleading, exaggerated, and factually incorrect. And so here are a list of these disputed claims. First of all, his claim that the Ukrainian government has banned the Moscow-backed Ukrainian Orthodox Church. It has not been banned. While Ukraine has proposed legislation to restrict organizations with ties to Russia amidst war. No surprise there. No formal nationwide ban has been enacted as of today. Some individual monasteries or clergy have been evicted. They have been charged with collaborationism with Russia. But the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, Moscow Patriarchate, it still operates in the country. I can go into all kinds of examples of that. So the second point here is the claim that the Moscow Patriarchate is entirely independent from the Russian Church. And this is highly disputed. So he says that, it's independent of Russia. Highly disputed. In May of 2022, after the war began, the Moscow-backed Orthodox Church in Ukraine stood up and said, oh, well, we're independent from Moscow. Moscow never recognized that, even to this day. And many of its bishops remain in communion with Kirill, and numerous investigations have shown ongoing administrative and financial links to Moscow during the same time that Moscow is killing Ukrainian civilians by bombing civilian targets. The third, his claim that Ukraine is violating international religious freedom law. This is a claim of his, but it's a matter of debate. It's not settled fact. The Ukrainian government argues its actions target, pro-Russian propaganda and collaboration during wartime, not religious belief per se, and that makes perfect sense. And what's surprising is that the fat hierarchs in the Ukrainian Orthodox Church Moscow Patriarchate haven't come to this conclusion on their own terms, with their own conscience, saying, hey, these missiles are killing innocent people. How can we be aligned with this? And what you had during the 1780s in the United States is you had the Anglican Church, the leaders here saying, well, yeah, we've just had a war with England. We can't be juridically aligned with the Crown of England. So they separate. They keep their liturgical and cultural connection with English Christianity, if you will. But they severed that administrative union with the British. It's just common sense. After your people have spilled their blood. And what's surprising is that during these 3 years of war, the fat hierarchs of the Russian-backed Ukrainian Orthodox Church never came to that point. They had to get to that point through the Ukrainian government passing legislation. So they had to be cajoled into action by legal action. This is not an attack on religious freedom. This is a wartime measure to preclude collaboration with a hostile power. And it's not just a fantasy or a theory. There's lots of evidence of monks and priests with the Moscow-backed Orthodox Church collaborating and leading to the deaths of people, telling them where people are gathered. This can't be tolerated. Another claim of Robert Amsterdam relates to the eviction of monks from the famous cave monastery, and that it's pure religious persecution. This is absurd. I've been there. I spoke to these monks on both sides of the fence. I don't know if he's done that, but I have. And the eviction was based on alleged violations of lease agreements and national security concerns. But at the end of the day, there is no eviction. I was there, and you have the Moscow-backed monks living there. And the Kiev Patriarchate, the Ukrainian Orthodox monks coming in on Sundays and other days to celebrate the Divine Liturgy in the main church, but the Moscow-backed monks still live there. Since it's a national heritage site, the question is, why has the Moscow Patriarchate Church not been allowing Christians to use that site for over 30 years? That's the scandal. Now, Ukrainian authorities have cited unpaid rent, unauthorized construction at a national heritage site, it's 1,000 years old, and suspected collaboration with Russian agents. But they've not banned them. Courts are currently handling some of these issues, and due process appears to be occurring. So let's get back to this whole parallel between medieval Christians and Christians today. It's the blindness to atrocities then and now. Blindness to atrocities. Just as medieval Europeans ignored Mongol invasion and the Mongol devastation to cling to the Prester John myth, today's conservatives, my own kind of tribe, they downplay and ignore a whole host of things from Russia. Russia's invasion of Ukraine and all the massacres, the rapes, the Bucha massacre, the bombing of civilian infrastructure on a daily basis, not military sites, civilian infrastructure. Just sweep that under the carpet. The forced kidnapping and or deportation of tens of thousands of Ukrainian children, the suppression of dissent within their own borders, to say nothing of what they're doing to people in the areas they control in Ukraine. We're talking about imprisoning their own people, poisoning them, torturing them, murder of countless leaders in business, journalism, and politics, the crackdown on anti-war protesters. I personally know of priests in Russia who are threatened if they speak about what's happening to innocent people in Russia. The control of media and the outlawing of independent journalism. The justification often lies, on the part of my fellow conservatives, this justification often lies in a perceived greater good. Well, at least they're standing for Christian values. Or, well, they're not pushing transgender ideology, therefore, we're going to turn our eyes. The result is a dangerous moral compromise, people, embracing authoritarianism to push back against liberalism, much like medieval Christians embraced Mongol violence and tolerated it against the Christians in Armenia and Georgia and Kiev Rus in order to push back against Islam. There are consequences to this. Psychological and political mechanisms are at work here. First of all, there's projection. Both medieval and modern actors project their hopes onto distant figures or nations, seeing what they want rather than what is. And there's also ideological desperation here. In both periods, perceived cultural decline fuels the search for saviors who will restore moral order or cultural significance. Turn back to God. He is our refuge, not horses, not swords or shields. Another thing here is there's a selective moral vision. Atrocities are ignored if they serve some kind of higher ideological goal. We don't want the transgender, godless leftists of the European Union to prevail. So because they hate Russia and Russia hates them, we're going to align with Russia. We're going to ignore, the atrocities they're committing in Ukraine because it serves a higher ideological goal of canceling out the Euro nutjob lefties. There's a messianic myth-making here. 800 years ago with Prester John in the 12th century, they kind of made a messianic myth out of the man. He didn't even exist. And they've made this messianic myth today, they're play acting in the personification of a Christian Russia of some sort, like it's 19th century Dostoevsky. They're play acting. It's the same role, offering the illusion of salvation from decline. It's never going to be external. It always has to begin internally. Confront the moral decline in your own life. There are other things at work here. The simplification of complex realities. Painting allies as purely good and enemies as purely evil, even when evidence shows otherwise. And we look at what Russia has done to people, the Christian pastors, Protestant and Orthodox and Catholic, that it has tortured, imprisoned, and killed in the areas of Ukraine that it currently occupies. And Christians here just turn a blind eye to it. So my conclusion here is this. History, people, warns us of the dangers of ideological desperation. Medieval Christians, overwhelmed, obviously so, but they were overwhelmed by the threat of Islam, and they conjured up myths and they ignored atrocities to cling to a fantasy ally. And today, many conservatives, overwhelmed by the cultural rise of liberalism, are doing the exact same thing with authoritarian Russia. The core lesson is this: compromising moral clarity for ideological alignment. Hello, Young Republican Club in New York. This leads to self-deception and it enables tyranny. Compromising moral clarity for ideological alignment compromises the truth of our claims about faith, about family, and about freedom. We base ourselves on biblical and rational principles derived from faith and natural law. We never base ourselves on politics or personalities. True allies must share values, not just enemies. Otherwise, we repeat the same patterns, swapping one danger for another. Friends, let history be a mirror and not a trap. God love you.